Welcome everyone to our CG seminar number 172. And today we go to Latin America and we talk about the Latin American public university model. This is a different idea of the university to the idea of the University of Cardinal Newman or Clark Kerr in the United States, not centrally focused on either the teaching of elite gentlemen as in England or the building of a multi-purpose research university as in the US. It's about social transformation and nation building in emerging countries. And the model that was developed in Latin America, very sophisticated, and it remains an important example worldwide, but it's run into all kinds of blockages and obstacles in its region of origin. And to talk about these things today, we have one of the world's foremost experts on higher education and on the Latin American model in particular. It's Dr. Imanol Ordorika from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. Imanol focuses on power, politics, and change in higher education. He's got a political science background and a background in student and university activism and leadership. Published a lot of books and articles. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ordorika, to Imanol, as we all know him, to our series. And can I, at this point, take you through the web protocols before we go to Imanol? Remember that the webinar is recorded so that everything you say and do in the chat and on camera will be on YouTube and on our website in future. When you're in the webinar, we advise you to keep yourself muted and keep your camera off until you come into the discussion. You can turn on your video in the bottom left-hand corner when you come into the discussion, and don't forget to unmute yourself when that happens. We invite you to ask questions. You ask questions by going into the chat initially, typing your question into the chat, and we'll then compose a Q&A list after Imanol has finished speaking based on what's in the chat. So good idea to, if you want to come in, to raise your question early. We find some of the best questions come in 5 minutes before the end, and by then we've filled the speaking list and we can't bring that person in. So make yourself known early in the chat if you can. At this point, I'm really happy to hand back to Imanol. Imanol, the floor is yours, or should I say the screen is yours.
Good morning from Mexico. Good afternoon in Europe. I think good morning in the US. I see some colleagues, very, very good colleagues from Chile and the United States, and all of you, dear colleagues from different countries in the world that are united or articulated. We use that word a lot in Latin America by the Center for Global Higher Education. Thank you for the opportunity to have a meaningful exchange with you. And thank you, Simon Marginson, for the invitation to participate in this seminar series. There's a very good article at the beginning of the confinement written by an Argentinian journalist that appeared in the New York Times in a Spanish piece in Spanish that says the world is flat. And it did become flat. Now we see each other in 2 dimensions, and we see the world through the lens of the Zoom screen and other screens. And this is the way we're going to interact. And I thank you all for the opportunity to do so. So I'm gonna share my screen. Just give me 1 second, and I think we'll be ready. I hope that you can all see the screen, the PowerPoint presentation that I have prepared for today. I wonder, Simon, if you can see the presentation.
I can, Imanol. Thank you.
Okay, great. So the name for the presentation actually was contribution by Simon, which was able to put in much better words what I was trying to convey in my difficulty to switch from Spanish to English. So he's already talked about what the idea of this presentation is, so I'm not gonna talk about it in general. Basically, I'm gonna present the historical evolution of what became, I think, a distinct tradition of higher education in Latin America, and how it came into a time of crisis and what is happening today. So let's go on. This Latin American tradition started with universities founded either by the Vatican or the Catholic Church in Latin America, in different countries in Latin America. There's a big dispute between universities. All of them claim, like in the case of my university, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, that we have nothing to do with the original Royal and Pontifical University of Mexico that was established by the Crown and the Vatican in 1551 in the norms, but really organized in 1553. But all these three universities that you see here, they all claim to be the first university in the colonial, Spanish colonial world. And you can see the little signs of the Vatican logo and the Spanish Crown logos to show the time when they were established legally, or when they were allowed to be established. For 300 years of colonial rule, universities were created in almost every country that we have in Latin America today. As you can see, the Dominican Republic, Peru, Mexico, Argentina, and there is always some sort of discussion about when the real origins of higher education institutions began. After 300 years of colonial domination by the Spaniards, and in the case of Brazil, by Portugal, which is a very particular case because no universities were established in Brazil by the Portuguese, very differently from the Spanish colonial domination. In the 19th century, the struggles for independence began, and some of them ran into the early 20th century in some of the countries. In most cases, the universities as institutions participated very marginally in the independence struggles, but they later, in the early independent days of the new nations, they became important sites of confrontations between liberals and conservatives. In some cases, the conservatives used to open the universities, which were very strongly connected to the church. They were very scholastic and they were very conservative. And then they were closed by liberals when they came to power, because they considered that these institutions were not progressive, and they were not permitting a trend of separation between church and state that with different degrees has been a constant in most Latin American nations. There is in the early 20th century, there is a very significant student movement that started not really in Cordoba in 1918, but in Montevideo, Uruguay, with the Student Congress in 1902, in which a set of principles for higher education were set up forward and organized. The most salient historically was the student movement in the National University of Cordoba in 1918, and its foundational document, the Manifiesto Liminar, that declared the importance of university autonomy, the university involvement in politics for social change, justice, and democracy. It established alliances with workers, unions, and peasant organizations. It embodied a very strong feeling of Latin Americanism, and with the growing presence of the United States, a strong anti-imperialism very much directed against the United States. for the inside workings of the institution, there was this idea of free teaching. Remember that these institutions were coming from very closed church rule, very scholastic thought, a lot of theology and religion teachings, and they were trying to move away from that into a more pluralist and academic and diverse academic environment. Given the commitment to social change, university extension or service might be called in some countries, became one of the essential functions of Latin American universities. This continues into our day in a diminished way. And the idea that the university should be ruled, I don't use the notion of shared governance, because in many countries this means faculty participation in university governance. Here it was co-governance, it was students, faculty, and alumni originally. This has also changed historically. And a very important element of that student movement in 1918 was the selection of faculty through competitive examinations. That is, that the church or other political groups in society would not be able to appoint faculty as they had been doing for decades. The Latin American tradition developed in conjunction with the consolidation or expansion of national projects in Latin America from the 1920s into the 1970s. It was about 50 years of what was called developmentalism. Strong state intervention in the economy, creation of a lot of state institutions. The universities were strongly connected to this national project. Basically, the Argentine student movement in 1918 was like a herald of the coming modernization process, moving from economies based on agrarian production into the growth of cities and the expansion of urban sites, the expansion also of a professional class, a professional middle class, and the process of industrialization in almost all of Latin America. The universities were connected in different ways. They participated in the creation of state institutions like ministries of education, communications, the judicial systems, even many of the important printed media of the time. They provided intellectual and social legitimation for the state in a recreation of history and national cultures. As I said before, they were vehicles for urbanization and industrialization in this transition from agrarian societies through the development of this professional, let's call it class. This is a very lax use of the notion of class, or this professional segment in the cities that grew during the first half of the 20th century. The universities, in most cases, played a very central role in most of the state projects. These big national universities, in the case of Argentina, several national universities, one national university, became dominant in teaching and research activities within their countries. And they could be the equivalent of the United States, the flagship universities. It's not the same concept, but you know, these very, very central institutions in the life of different countries. And for many years, they were a significant vehicle for social mobility, bringing incorporation of more marginal segments of societies into these professional middle classes. Now, in the late 1970s and 1980s, Latin America, as the rest of the world, suffered this move towards the end of the state, the benefactor state, the end of Keynesian policies, and with the coming up to government of Thatcher and Reagan, the return, if it can really be called that, we should discuss that more openly, or the materialization of the neoclassical economics project through the notion that the market could really organize society in an efficient way, in a much better way, and even to remove many of the inequalities that were so salient in most of the countries, at least in the periphery. So we lived a process that was, in some authors, called the creation of a new public philosophy, in which the economy became a way of thinking about every aspect of social life. The private sector was viewed as the most efficient and significant and important way to organize every social activity, from education to production to the distribution of public goods and whatever, and the marketization of society. This produced a crisis of in Latin American developmentalist projects, mainly expressed through the crisis of the debt. If any of you have been familiar with the situation of Latin American nations in the mid and late 1980s, where the foreign debt was so huge that several countries like Argentina or Mexico considered the possibility of just stop payments. Then some crazy stuff happened. Mexico started paying Argentina's debt in order to comply with International Monetary Fund policies. This was a period of the IMF had a very strong presence in the definition of government policies in Latin America, structural adjustment, payment, public spending cuts, and the adoption of modernization policies all over society, and in this case, particularly in higher education. Modernization policies, very briefly, were basically centered in institutional and financial diversification. Instead of traditional universities that played the role of teaching, research, and university extension, there was a very strong push for the development of technical or vocational education. Another diversification process was the expansion, huge expansion of private higher education in most of Latin America. This is very significant, most salient, and the earliest process occurred in Brazil, but this has happened, and I'll show you some information about this a little bit later, in other nations as well. The idea of strategic planning, new managerialism adopted as the way in which systems and institutions should be administered. The key policy in higher education in many countries, evaluation and assessment became the key policy aspect, and financial assets were allocated to universities, to research or teaching projects, and even to faculties' salaries through particular evaluation processes. I'll talk a little bit more about this maybe in the questions. And the adoption of universities were, as Simon has pointed out, there was always a balance between public and private orientation of the products of higher education historically, and the push towards the production of private goods and the exchange of these goods in the market happened in higher education. The idea that competition would model through institutions and make the worse institutions disappear, you know, all these market arguments. But there were some significant cases in which like pseudo-market policies were adopted as part of university life, such is the case of the merit pay systems in Mexico, most significantly, and in Argentina and other countries in Latin America, where most of the faculty income comes from these merit-based programs instead of basic salaries. Starting in the 1980s and almost up to the 2005, in most countries, there were financial hardships, and the universities had a very difficult time moving from this very entrenched notion of the university as a constructor of the state, as connected to state policies, as participant in the creation and running of state institutions. Suddenly was completely separated from diminished state intervention in the economy and development of nations. And there was not a clear idea of where universities were running to, what was their central project. And at this point in time, in the 1990s, early 2000s, the idea that the US elite research university was the model that should be adopted and followed had a lot of currency between government officials and university administrators, and there was a strong push towards trying to mimic. And I think this word is the most appropriate, mimic, because it doesn't really, it was the idea that we could resemble Harvard in every one of our public institutions in Latin America, even though Harvard is not a public institution, that we could become elite research universities with large postgraduate departments and a strong connection to the productive side of the economy and society, the production of patents and stuff like that, a very strong push towards international circulation of knowledge, the adoption of research topics that could be interesting abroad, and the participation in index journals. All this became the mantra for higher education in Latin America for almost 20 years, and maybe up to our days. Of course, this idea of with the presence of rankings at the international level, universities started looking at international rankings and trying to do well in these rankings. The University of Sao Paulo in Brazil has been the most successful one. Now the rankings are so unreliable that they produce a worldwide ranking in which some Latin American institutions, there's like a hierarchy of Latin American institutions, and then both the Times and QS have their Latin American rankings, in which the institutions switch places completely because they use different methodologies. But the idea that rankings were really showing the quality and success of higher education institutions was helping to run this model as a new hegemonic model in Latin America. Of course, there were very significant resistance and critiques to the notions that universities should increase tuition and draw resources from privatized resources from students and their families. There were very, very huge student movements in Mexico and in Chile and in Argentina, Colombia, and other countries against tuition increases, against privatization of public universities, against the expansion of the private sector, and most significantly against money-making enterprises in higher education. Part of this resistance became present in three of the Latin American regional conferences of higher education that preceded the World Congress of Higher Education in UNESCO. in which there is kind of a schizophrenic condition, because there is this beautiful manifests by the regional conferences under the motto or the notion that higher education is a public social good, a universal human right, and a state obligation that is not is adopted by almost every country as in a declarative sense, but it doesn't really operate or rule the way in which higher education policies are developed in most countries. In this context, we have enrollments that have grown significantly in the last 30 years, but there's a very large variation by country, from 35 to 90% of the age group. If we look at gross enrollments by country, these numbers go from 20 to 80%, Argentina being the largest case. We will see that later, but the average for Latin America is 46% enrollment on average. It depends on which data you take. But as has been pointed out by some of the most important researchers in Latin America, one of them present here, Andrés Bernasconi, and originally Jose Joaquin Brunner, Latin America is the most highly privatized region in higher education, with 48% of private enrollments in private higher education. Access to higher education is highly stratified by income. This is not different than most of the world, but it's much more extreme. And given this situation, we have had significant constant of student struggles for access and tuition-free higher education in most of the countries of Latin America. Most recently, just before the confinement by COVID-19, very strong student movements, female student movements for gender equality within higher education systems and institutions, and against gender violence. This is a very, very important process that is going on in most of Latin America. Let me show a couple of graphics here. These are gross national enrollments in 2014. International data is not it's not renewed very frequently. The most reliable, this I have taken from Jose Joaquin Brunner's CINDA report in 2016. It shows that significantly enough, female enrollments are higher than male enrollments. And in spite of that, it should be said that within institutions, there are still very large inequalities in terms of gender. But you can see the case of Guatemala. We have the comparison with Spain and Portugal and Australia, Great Britain and Korea, Estonia, just to show how this wide variation in national enrollments portrays the condition of the subcontinent or the Latin American region. But if we look at enrollment percentage by income quintiles, we can see that the two or three first quintiles in the most deprived sectors of society barely make it to higher education, and it still remains, although massive in terms of the size of enrollments, the higher education institutions remain elitist in terms of the exclusion of marginal sectors of society. This is a comparison of public and private enrollments in 2017. In 2017, as I said before, the average for Latin America is 48%, but you can see also the differences. The most privatized systems are Chile and Brazil, with increasing privatization in Mexico, for example, and Costa Rica. Just let me go back. These were the conditions before COVID-19. all of these conditions have been, in some way, these inequalities and tensions in Latin American higher education have been compounded by new challenges. The most significant are the fact that most of Latin American universities have switched into total online distance education. In the majority of institutions, there is no other part of the educational process, no presential education in classrooms, even limited presence, in a condition in which in Latin America, 50% of homes have no access, or it's the same. I like to stress the fact that a lot of families do not have access to internet. In many countries, the universities have tried to set up, projects in which they provide students with tablets and they pay for access to internet through different providers. This has produced a severe student attrition. There is no data, not even at the national level, but just to let you know, my institution, this is probably some of you know, has 360,000 students, and in the end of the last semester, there were only about 140,000 student registrations. These are not even individual students necessarily, but ending the semester a few months ago. So this is about 2/3 student attrition in the most optimistic idea. Probably as it's happening in other countries, female students and faculty are their situation of inequality has been increased by overcharge. They are overcharged by the need to attend home or domestic chores, childcare during working hours, and homeschooling. In some countries like Mexico, the schools are also, basic education is also online. There is no presential, the students don't go to schools. So parents have become full-time teachers for their children. Another impact has been in financing. Their institutions have had a reduction of income, either private or public, and cost increases due to the need to expand technological services to their communities. And the national systems are suffering fiscal restrictions and the need to increment support for students in the way of scholarships and other projects. The very strong student movements that were taking place were cut short by confinement, but there are still some situations in which students have occupied empty buildings in the universities, female students demanding the stop to harassment by faculty and by other students. In many cases, the already centralized and authoritarian governance systems in Latin American higher education has been increased, given the distance and functioning of institutions and collegial bodies through the internet and this two-dimensional world we were talking about. Just to finish, I have argued, and this was part of some of the most important resolutions of the regional conference in 2018 in Cordoba, Argentina, 100 years after the student movement, the need to provide a new identities for Latin America, a new identity for Latin American universities, to recreate the distinct tradition of Latin American higher education through the repoliticization of the university, the participation of universities in public national debates, given the weakness and erosion of political systems. I think this is a something that has happened all over the world. And if we have any doubt, we should just look at the electoral process in the United States lately. Parties are not providing the space for public debate that is necessary. I think that universities should be taking an increased role in this public debate about the most salient issues of our societies, to reestablish the notion of commitment to society and societal transformation, equality and democratization that stems from the Cordova tradition, that should be ingrained into higher education, at least into public higher education institutions. Again, there has to be increased university autonomy in order to be able to perform with the foundation of knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination in this participation in the political construction of Latin American societies. Internal democratization of institutions. A central issue today, almost all over the world, is gender equality. And I have not put it in writing here, a strong push against gender violence, which is surprisingly enough is so present and so significant in our universities and other higher education institutions. And of course, the push towards increases and the constant provision of public funding and the reestablishment of free higher education as opposed to market-driven policies of increased tuition and diversification of funding. So Simon, if it's okay with you, I'm going to leave it there. This was obviously like a telegraphic presentation of the situation in Latin America, and we can probably go deeper into many of these issues through the questions and the comments by the people who are part of our gathering today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Imanol. Thank you very much. I mean, you opened up a lot for us, and to think about both the past and the present and the future. I'm going to start the discussion by asking you about the model, this Cordova model, and this very advanced idea that the university can play a role in creating a more modern, more democratic, more advanced kind of society through its critical function, through the training of the next generation of social leaders, and so on. But two questions. I mean, there's kind of questions to try to tease out the possibilities that this model offers. Firstly, it seems that it's got a critical point. It seems that it depends on a state which is prepared to accept the idea that the university can be constructive force for state renewal and state development, and at the same time is prepared to respect the autonomy of the university in pursuing this mission. So the critical question is it realistic to expect that such a state will take this stance on the university? Because the history, of course, is state intervention, clumsy, bad, repressive intervention in the university in many cases. So the second question is, has this reform model ever been successful? Has it taken place anywhere in the continent? Have we seen examples where this kind of reforming university, state building university, has been allowed to have a good impact?
Thank you, Simon. The first question depends very much on an assessment of political processes that are going on in the region in the last 10 or 15 years. We have had a move away from totalitarian governments, military dictatorships in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, a state party dictatorship in Mexico. It has been called like that, even though it was not a military domination. It was like an authoritarian regime in classical political science. there have been changes towards the left and then like a regression to the right, and it seems that things are moving to the left again. In spite of all these political changes, in most cases, and I think Chile is a very good example of this, in spite of the democratization process in Chile after the Pinochet dictatorship, educational policies remain very much linked to market orientations through all of higher education. The expansion of private for-profits, and all against the idea of the state building university model that was, you know, in some ways the existing model in Latin America through the earlier part of the 20th century. I think that strong societal participation and the erosion of the neoliberal model in Latin America has been something that has been acknowledged by governments from the center right and center left. There has not been a clear path for economic development in a non-neoliberal model. This is what is happening in Mexico, where with a new center, left of center, slightly left of center government claims to be totally anti-neoliberal and has completely neoliberal policies in place, even towards higher education. But I think that there's a process in Latin America of very strong social mobilization. The case of Chile is very important. It started with student movements in the last 5 to 8 years, and now very broad societal movements that have opened the way for a new constitution and for new developments in higher education. One of the most important cases is the idea of tuition-free higher education, which was not completely established in Chile, but was conquered by the student movements up to some extent, covering the most deprived segments of society. And probably Andres could be could have a clear picture of what is going on there. So yes, I do think that it's we cannot rely on the recreation of a state building university model automatically or inertial. Even the notion of recreation is not trying to establish the same model again. The idea of a university, I call it now a repoliticized university that plays a role essentially in public debates about society, and not so much as what happened in the 50s when the ministries were being created and university members who were rectors and health ministers at the same time were giving materialized this idea of the state building university in many countries. This is a huge area of contest. That is what I would respond very succinctly or briefly to your first question. But universities became immobilized in their identity crisis. We became like part of society to which market changes were being applied, and we had no idea where we could go through to. And it was only some student movements that were resisting. And, you know, intellectuals, higher education academics, and some rectors that produced these very fine declarations at the regional level, but that had no continuity to policy. So I'd say, yes, we have to struggle in order to move our institutions in that direction. Has the model ever been successful? I would say that we have very important examples in different countries in Latin America where the model, even though it was never thought of as a model of higher education, except in these ideas that were put forward by the autonomy reform movements that happened in Cordoba and later in many Latin American countries, was really successful from the 1950s to the 70s. In Mexico, for example, the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health came out of the National University. No, they were populated, designed, and organized by the university itself. I think that in Argentina, the reform movement was like a predecessor of the modernization movements in Argentinian that took place in the Argentinian society in the 1920s and 30s. Argentina has a very how do you say, like hectic history of military coups and then the Peronista governments and all this stuff that is complex and sometimes difficult to understand. Venezuela had a central university many decades before Chavismo and all of this, in which the university was at the core of the development of the oil industry in that country. And we have seen this as a model that was successful and could not continue to be successful because it was totally out of sync with government and national projects in the continent in the latter part, in the last 25 years of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century.
We should always unmute ourselves before we speak. I mean, clearly university is only one part of the process of social transformation, and the idea that the university is kind of the vanguard of modernization and transformation, it alone is a sort of key special institution, is an idea of the past. And also I take from your response that Chile is such an important country for all of us, you know, that we need to know much more about what's happened there, and we need to talk about it at a world level. So we should have a webinar on Chile, specifically, I think, in future. Now, we've got Victorita Triff, Brian Passa, Fanny Urego, Andres Bernasconi, and Cristina Cavallo all on the call list. So we'll try and get as much of this in as we can. We won't be able to go past 3:05, I'm afraid. So when you're called in, turn your camera on, unmute your mic, and ask your question. Victorita first, please.
Simon, one question first. Should I take note of all the questions and then respond to all of them?
I think that's a good idea. You know, we haven't got enough time to deal with them all one by one. So Victorita, can you come in, and then we'll bring in Brian.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Simon, for this very interesting debate from today. Congratulations for the contributor for today. There are many debates about the old paradigm of Latin American universities and the contemporary geopolitical space. I am wondering how to create a new framework for the future dominant discourse about Latin American universities, please.
Thank you, Victorita. Brian.
Hi, thank you, Imanol, for your very powerful presentation, and also for all your work on powerful work on theorizing the state and higher education and the politics of higher education over the years. My question is, given the kind of increasing consolidation of capital globally and the rise of neoliberal policies, do you think that predicts for more for-profit education institutions throughout Latin America? And I know this was a significant issue of contest in Chile, so I'll leave it to you to talk a little bit about for-profits.
Thanks, Brian. Fanny Urego, are you there, please? Your mic. You need to unmute yourself. Sorry, Fanny, we don't have any sound. These things happen. So I think perhaps we might take your question in from the chat. Imanol, can you check Fanny's question while we're receiving the torrent of other questions? If you could do that, then we'll cover Fanny as well. Andres Benasconi, are you there, please?
Thank you, Simon, and greetings to all the distinguished colleagues that have gathered today to hear this, as usual, insightful presentation from Imanol. Imanol, you sort of answered my question when answering Simon's earlier question. I was wondering whether you see any difference in left-leaning governments and right-leaning governments as to higher education policy in general, and I think you said that the grip of the neoliberal model really goes beyond the political orientation of the governments. So if that's the case, would you agree with the statement that nowadays social movements have a greater agency in shifting higher education policy than governments do?
Thanks, Andres. Cristina Cavallo.
Good morning from Brazil. I'm Cristina from Universidad of Brasilia. Thank you so much, Professor Imanol, Professor Simon, for this interesting seminar. At the moment, some public universities in Brazil have borrowed and donated computers and paid the internet package for poor students. What kind of solutions you can observe in public universities in Latin America regarding reduced inequalities of access during pandemic? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Christina, and thank you for your excellent participation in our webinar series. We're really good to see you again.
Thank you so much.
I think we can bring in Alberto Lazari as well. Alberto, are you there, please? Hello, Alberto. Alberto has a question in the chat.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Simon. And thank you, Professor Ordorika, for your really insightful presentation. My question is, do you think that academic partnerships and mobility programs for both professors and students, both within Latin America and worldwide, could somehow help promote positive change within Latin American higher education institutions, as well as in European higher education institutions? I, for once, was exposed to this process, and I personally believe that I benefited a lot from it.
Thanks, Alberto. Alex Trindade, are you there, please? Alex.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, I'm Alex. I'm doing my PhD. I'm a PhD student in Cambridge, and I'm looking at higher education and universities in Brazil. I'm curious about your vision in terms of how universities can provide this space to reimagine universities, and especially like projects such as UNILA or Unitierra, and other discussions about how to put spaces for new knowledge or for the knowledge from the people from the communities. So it would be a tendency in Latin America world would be like very small groups and no space in this market situation that we face. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Now, Imanol, just before you start answering everyone, Fanny's question was this. I agree market dynamic indeed has transformed higher education organizations and the interaction between them, also with consumers and stakeholders. But how is the impact on academic aspects, specifically teaching or disciplinary issues? So it's a question about the impact of market forces on teaching or disciplinary issues. Imanol, I think you have the opportunity now to answer this many interesting questions.
If I'm not wrong, I think we have like 9 minutes. It's tough to address all of your questions, and thank you very much for all of them. I'm going to try to connect some of them blend them into some of the answers. the idea that there is a debate among scholars and among Latin American university officials about this notion of Latin American tradition. Some people do not agree that this Latin American tradition exists at all. And I think that we could spend a lot of time going back historically to try to figure this out. But it makes much more sense for me to try to move universities into thinking that we have a different situation in Latin America that has, it's a very heterogeneous region, but has many similarities in terms of history and in terms of context today that could allow us to think of universities in a different way, moving away from the hegemonic US elite research university model. And that we have spent too much time trying to build cutting edge research projects in some areas that are totally outside of our realities and our needs. And I'm not implying that the quality of our institutions is not good enough. I think that they are good and they are serving different purposes that are not recognized internationally. And this is the direction that we should move towards. And this implies part of the work that we have done collectively and individually with Simon and Brian and many others against this homogenizing notion put forward by the rankings at the international level. We really need to spark new debates. It doesn't matter if we all agree that there is an old paradigm, a common old paradigm about Latin American higher education. What matters most is to look at political environments. Today I'm going to address Andres' question and how the moves in political governments to the left or the right has impacted higher education differently. In Brazil, for example, and probably Alex or Cristina could explain this better, the Lula and Dilma Rousseff governments did allow for an expansion of public higher education, the creation of new institutions, the establishment of autonomy in legal terms, and the establishment of quotas for racial quotas. This is not the most politically correct way to phrase it, but this is the limits of my English. Affirmative action policies to be established, and most of this has been drawn backwards. Alex was talking about UNILA. Brazil is a very particular situation. You're having a presidential dictatorship with ideas that were already considered fascist and non-politically correct in the early part of after the Second World War. Bolsonaro is something, it's like Trump or something from another world, another reality. So it's in this condition, it seems difficult to reimagine universities without a strong commitment of states financing and opening a space. This goes back to Simon's question, for the development of a different actor in contemporary societies. And I do think, Andres, as you pointed out, that it is social movements within Latin American societies that are taking the strongest workload of transforming not only universities, but societies. They go way beyond what left-leaning or right-leaning governments do, especially when we have governments from the left, allegedly from the left, like in the case of Mexico. Please let me strongly put the allegedly there, because we really need to have student mobilization and very strong social society valuing public higher education in order to address many of their concerns, in order to be able to make these shifts in connecting universities to societies. In the Chilean uprisals of last year, universities played a major role, not only in terms of current student participation, but accumulated experience, the ideas of how to organize struggles. And this has happened all over Latin America. In spite of this, I think that we still have some of the most direct impacts of neoliberalism in teaching and research. Fanny Urago's question, we have moved away from full-time faculty to part-timers, bigger classrooms, cutting costs and expenditures in higher education. In this way, we have moved into the idea that the only valued research is the one that is published in international index journals. I myself have just sent an article on Latin American student movements that should be probably published in a Latin American journal. I sent it to higher education, Simon. So just because my income depends on publishing in these very highly reputed and recognized international journals. And these are ways in which the neoliberal model has impacted and is still having an impact in higher education. And moving away from those apparently minor issues of everyday life in higher education is even more difficult than moving institutions into playing a central role as an actor in trying to change universities and their surrounding societies. I think that I agree that academic partnerships and mobility promote positive change. We have, even before the pandemic, we have a very bad situation in Latin America. We don't have something similar to the Erasmus project. Most of the migration, the academic migrations in Latin America were due to political totalitarianism in South America, with Mexico benefiting from a lot of very reputed and well-known scholars coming to our national autonomous university because they had to leave Chile and Argentina and Brazil. So I'm going to finish just addressing Cristina Cavallo's question about solutions towards reduced inequality during the pandemic. I think that looking at these institutional projects of financing internet access and all of that is not gonna make it. We are not clear on what needs to happen in order to go beyond this makeup policies. They look good in the media, but they are not really attacking the problem. I think this would make us go for another 10 minutes, and I think I should cut it there. But basically, our inequalities come from before the pandemic, and universal access is one issue. Affirmative action policies. These are things that we have to adopt in order to really address inequality. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Imanol. I mean, it was an outstanding contribution to all of us. And, you know, we could have clearly benefited from a longer webinar today. You know, you opened up so many doorways in it for us, and there's so many voices in this webinar that want to contribute to the discussion. So really thank everyone for the excellent questions and statements. And most of all, you know, thank Imanol for his contribution and welcome him back to take part in any future discussions we have on any topic. I think he has a great deal to contribute to us. Next webinar in our series is next Tuesday, the 1st of December, not yet Christmas, but getting closer. And we have Maria Ivancheva and Brian Garvey talking about how technology is being used as an instrument of micromanagement in new universities and in fulfillment of the neoliberal project. So once again, the critique of neoliberalism at the center of our thinking, as it has been today. Thank you again, Imanol, and thank you everyone for your participation. Bye for now.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Simon. Ryan.
Thank you, Imanol. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Andres.